Hey, my spookies. Before we start the show, I have some wonderful news. We just got all of the results back from my dog Chicano's cancer scans. It looks like the chemo is working. Everything is looking the way the oncologist wanted, and we're only halfway through the chemo treatments. That means the only thing we really have to worry about now is paying for it. But we've raised over $2,500 so far, so if you can in any way help, please go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Help My Dog. I really appreciate it. But now, my friends, it's time for the show. Does artificial intelligence have you creeped out? Are you disturbed by the fact that ChatGPT can hold a conversation with you and maybe even teach you some things? Well, you're not alone. And, frankly, you're not looking close enough because the computer in your home may be just as dangerous.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and I have some exciting news for you before we start the show. Myself and my producing partners on Weekly Spooky, Rob Fields and Dan Wilder, have a brand new treat for you in visual form. We've released a brand new horror television series that you can watch completely free on Tubi TV. That's right, you can watch our series, Found Footage, right on Tubi, completely and utterly free to you. All you have to do is go to tubitv.com, TUBI, or search TUBI on your Roku, install the app, search Found Footage, the series, and enjoy 8 episodes of fear captured on video just for you, with episodes directed by myself, by Dan Wilder, by Joe Salmo, who's a regular contributor here, and episodes written by Shane Migliavaca, whose story we're featuring tonight, and so many more names I think you're going to recognize right away. So go to Tubi right now. Well, maybe not right now. As soon as you're done listening, driving, doing the dishes, whatever you may be doing, and check out Found Footage, the series, on Tubi. It's a big deal. This is our first full-blown step into television, and if it does well, a season 2 is inevitable. But anyway, that's enough plugs for right now. The only other plug I'm going to say is make sure you are subscribed to this show. You don't want to miss all the cool things we have coming up. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star rating. It really does help, and it doesn't cost you a penny. But now it's time for a story all about the things between the cogs and tubes in our electronics. Oh yes, there's more than meets the eye, and we're going to hear all about it after these quick words. Ghosts in the Machine by Shane Migliavaca. She's a weirdo. She's a weirdo, Marcy Collins chanted under her breath as Janet Rogers walked by with her lunch. Marcy and her pack of hyenas sat at their table staring daggers at the new girl. She couldn't understand why they hated her so much. Janet had just moved to Foster, New York with her Aunt Tina. Her parents had died in a car accident a year ago, and since then, she'd been taken in by her mother's sister. They'd moved to Foster so Tina could take care of her sick mother. Janet's grandmother scared her a little. She was very religious, and not above cracking you on the knuckles if you got out of line, not to mention her vicious little dog, Jasper. Although, since they'd moved in, the old woman hadn't been too bad, due to her sickness, no doubt. Whatever the case, Janet would rather be in her room at that big old house than here getting harassed in the cafeteria. Janet found a table in the corner, by the window. She nibbled on her slice of pizza while reading a book, trying to ignore the drama around her, trying not to think about her mom and dad. Having an emotional breakdown in front of Marcy and the others would sink her already shaky reputation at school. After lunch, Janet waited for the cafeteria to clear out a little. Gathering up her books, she headed for the exit, hoping to slip out and head towards her next class. Marcy and her crew already appeared to have taken off, powdering their noses no doubt, and gossiping in the bathroom. She'd just stepped out into the hall when a voice cut through her like a knife through butter. "Where you headed, plebe?" Janet spun around to see Marcy standing there with her pack of hyenas. The other girls snickered. If only Janet could do what she envisioned, knocking Marcy on the floor with one punch. "Leave me alone." "Where do you buy your clothes?" one of the girls asked. "Salvation Army, I bet," answered another. Marcy pawed at Janet's stack of books. "What's with all the books? You're always reading. Think you're better than us?" "No, just leave me alone." One of the girls shoved Janet, making her drop her books. A group of students stood watching, laughing and clapping, as Marcy and her pals pushed Janet back and forth, till the dazed girl landed on her butt on the floor. Before she could react, they gathered up her fallen books and ran off. Scrambling to her feet, Janet shot daggers at the other kids. "Thanks for nothing." She ran down the hall trying to catch Marcy and her books. Rounding a corner, Janet noticed Marcy running up the stairs to the second floor. "Come on, slowpoke. Geez, too many snacks?" Janet weaved through the kids milling about in the hallway in hot pursuit of Marcy, who was now on the third floor. Adrenaline and anger the only things keeping her going. Marcy darted into a room at the end of the hall. Music class. Empty this period. When Janet skidded into the room, Marcy was standing in front of one of the windows. The open window overlooked an alley behind the high school. Marcy dangled one of the books out of the window. She grinned upon seeing Janet. "Want it?" "Don't." "Oopsie." Marcy dropped the book, quickly grabbing another as Janet charged at her. She flung the second book before Janet could reach her. Enraged, Janet grabbed her by the arm, yanking Marcy away from the window. "What's all this?" an authoritative voice asked. The girls turned. In the door stood the white-bearded, burly music teacher, Mr. Fraser. "What the?" he stammered, equally angry and perplexed. "What the French toast are you girls doing in my classroom?" After spending the rest of the day in the principal's office, trying to explain what Marcy had done, Janet went to the alley behind the school where her book lay scattered about. Trying not to break down on the spot, she gathered her books up. Principal Palmer promised the other girls would return the rest tomorrow. Of course, he'd let Marcy off with a lame warning. Her dad was a prominent local lawyer. Some of these books had been her father's. He'd been a college professor. That's what she got for bringing them to school. Since they'd moved here, Janet had a target on her back. She dressed in grungy-looking clothes and liked to read, the opposite of Marcy and her pals. Janet should have expected they'd escalate things. Walking home, Janet wanted nothing more than to bury her head in a pillow and not come up until Saturday morning. She prayed Aunt Tina was in a good mood. Of course, that depended on how much trouble Grandma had been today. The house was the last on the left of a one-way street. The 3-story monstrosity had once really been something. Her grandparents had been pretty well off years ago. Not so much now. The house had fallen into disrepair. Paint was chipping off the outside, and wind had torn some of the tiles off the roof. Jasper came yipping and snarling at her as she entered the house. "Go play in traffic," Janet glared. "You little turd." Entering what had been her grandfather's study, the dog hot on her heels, Janet set the books down on the old desk. She'd put them away later. Right now, she needed something cold to drink. The large kitchen was empty. Maybe Aunt Tina was upstairs. Taking a can of soda from the fridge, Janet popped it open. She nearly downed the can's contents in one gulp, cold soda dribbling down her chin. Lowering the can, Janet jumped backwards. Her grandmother sat in a wheelchair staring at her. "What are you doing in here?" the old woman asked. "Just getting a drink." "Who are you?" the old woman cried out. "It's me, Graham. Janet." "Who? Jane? I don't know any Jane," The old woman backed up her wheelchair. "Get out of my house! It's Janet, your granddaughter." "You lie. I have no granddaughter." "Aunt Tina! Aunt Tina!" Janet hollered, scared and a little confused. The old woman wheeled away, threatening to call the police. After a few moments, Tina came storming into the kitchen, looking frazzled. "What's wrong?" Janet felt a hot tear rush down her cheek. "Graham, she doesn't recognize me," she sobbed. "Said she was going to call the cops." "Calm down, honey," Tina smiled. "I'll talk to her. Stay here." Tina left, leaving a confused Janet to dry her face and ponder what had just happened. She felt her head spin. First Marcy, and now her grandma. How could the day get any worse? Suddenly, the dirty dishes in the sink began to shake, vibrate, before flying out of the sink and crashing to the floor, shattering. She scrambled back, startled just in time for her aunt to come back. Tina looked at the dishes, then the shaken Janet. "What happened?" I don't know." She tried to explain to her aunt what had happened, sensing the woman didn't buy it one bit. "Is Graham okay?" Janet asked, sweeping up bits of broken plates. "It's her mind. The disease is affecting it. She's having trouble distinguishing memories from the past with those of the present, so for her, reality is one big jumble." Laying in bed that night, Janet stared up at the ceiling. Thunder rumbled in the distance as it started to rain outside. Her thoughts were focused on something from one of her father's books. What was reality? Was it high school? Her aunt? The storm outside? Or was it just through her eyes? Was it all created by her mind? If that was true, could she bring her parents back? No, she'd wished so hard for them to be alive and well after the accident. And nothing had happened. Eventually, she dozed off to the sound of rain pouring down outside, waking again sometime later to the sound of rain hammering the house, a large thunderclap that rattled the entire building. All the rain was making Janet need to use the bathroom. A little groggy, she fumbled her way out of the bedroom, guided by bright flashes of lightning outside. Her bedroom was on the 3rd floor. When her mother and Tina had been little, their bedrooms had been up here. And when they'd grown up and left, it had been turned into storage space and a guest room. Unfortunately, there was no bathroom on this floor, which meant she'd have to go down to the 2nd floor. Stepping into the hall, the drip, drip, drip of the bucket at the end of the hall greeted her. She'd have to remember to check that in the morning. The roof was leaking up here, and she had bucket patrol. Janet had forgotten one day, and one of the buckets had overflown. The water had dripped down to the 2nd floor. Halfway to the stairs, and lightning lit up the night again. Janet froze in her tracks as a woman stood watching her at the end of the hall. "Aunt Tina?" she asked, her voice quivering. "Is that you?" Standing there, Janet could only hear her own breathing. Darkness enveloped her until the next flash of lightning. The woman stood closer now, reaching out for her. In the brief flash, she could make out that it wasn't her aunt. Bolting, Janet ran back to her bedroom. She sat on her bed after blocking the door with her dresser, listening to the storm outside, while never taking her eyes from the blocked entrance. That woman, in that brief glimpse of her, there had been something familiar about her. She tried to place where she'd seen that face before. Her fatigue got the better of her, and towards morning Janet fell asleep for a couple of hours. She woke to knocking at her bedroom door. "You awake?" her aunt asked. "You'll be late." I'm up, Janet answered, clearing the cobwebs from her head. Janet looked across at her door. The dresser she'd pushed in front was back where it belonged. Had it been a dream? That strange woman? There wasn't much time to ponder last night as Janet hurried to get dressed and ready for school. She scarfed down some breakfast and headed out to wait for the bus. 3rd period, Janet sat in computer class working on her project. She tried to concentrate on the work that needed to be done. Typing in code, something began to change on monitor. The screen flickered. The lines of code began forming a woman's face. Jumping back, Janet looked around the classroom to see if anybody else was experiencing the same thing. They all appeared to be calmly going about their work, some whispering and joking with one another. Nothing out of the ordinary. Turning back to the screen, A face made of green code, vaguely resembling a woman's, stared back at her. "Find me. Find yourself," a voice crackled through the speaker. "I can help unlock the world for you." What? Suddenly, Janet was pushed forward into the desk, getting hit from behind. She turned to see Marcy and her posse walk by. "See you in gym class, fruitcake." Crap, gym class. Was the period over already? Turning back to the monitor, the face was gone. Just the code of her project appeared. Quickly saving her work, she headed to the gym, her least favorite place in the whole school. Today they were outside playing field hockey. Of course, she was one of the last chosen. Janet hung back during the game. She wasn't very good at it and tried to stay away from the action. Watching the others play, Janet thought about the face on the computer. It was the woman from the hall last night. She was sure. Although the face was made of computer code, it had the same familiarity to it. She didn't dream that. "Coming at you, weirdo." Marcy glared at her from across the field. She hit the hockey ball towards Janet, ensuring everybody would come charging at her, Marcy included. Janet felt a sharp elbow jab in the ribs, followed by a push, sending her to the ground. Looking up from a face full of grass, she saw Marcy smiling down at her. That was it. Janet got up, jumping on Marcy. She wrestled her to the ground as the game stopped. The other girls cheered as the two fought on the ground, rolling back and forth, throwing punches and pulling hair. The firm hands of Miss Anderson pulled Janet off of Marcy. Most of the girls pointed their fingers at Janet, silently accusing her of starting it. It was off to the principal's office, once again. This time, by herself. They'd called home and left a message on the answering machine for her aunt. Janet considered erasing it, but she was fairly certain the school would call again if they didn't hear from Aunt Tina. She decided to face the music and get it over with. Walking home, Janet dreaded opening the door. Jasper would be barking and nipping at her, not to mention her grandmother. What would the old woman be like today? Then, of course, Tina would get that message from school. It would be nice, at least, if she didn't have to deal with that mean little dog. Jasper reminded her of Marcy. Always yipping at her, she prayed the dog would just run away. A shudder ran through her body as Janet looked up at the house. Letting out a defeated sigh, she walked up the front steps. Turning the knob, she spoke. "Leave me alone, you little turd. Just go away." Entering, the house was quiet. No Jasper. Maybe the little pain in the butt was sleeping. Unobstructed, Janet headed to the kitchen and downed not one, but 2 sodas in rapid succession. She figured she deserved them after today. Looking around, something seemed off about the kitchen. Something Janet couldn't put her finger on. She shrugged. Maybe her aunt had cleaned it or something. Janet headed upstairs. The quiet was starting to unnerve her. She hadn't noticed if the car was in the driveway. Maybe Tina had taken Graham to a doctor's appointment. They moved the old woman's room downstairs once she'd been confined to a wheelchair. She generally stayed away from her grandmother's room. The smell of it bothered her. On the second floor, she went to her aunt's room. Tina was busy dusting off her dresser. There was an assortment of knickknacks, jewelry, and photos covering its surface. Janet lightly knocked on the open door. The woman turned and smiled at her. "Is everything okay?" Janet asked. Tina frowned. "Yes, honey, why?" "It's just so quiet." "Well, your grandmother is taking a little afternoon nap." "Jasper taking a nap with her?" Tina tilted her head, a perplexed look etched on her face. "Who's Jasper, honey?" "Graham's mean little dog, always barking." Tina shook her head. "Your grandmother's never had a dog." Was it possible? Had she made the dog disappear? No. The strange woman on the screen, the apparition in the hall, she'd done it. She'd said she could help Janet. Why did that woman's face feel so familiar? A sudden realization hit the girl. Janet looked at the photos on her aunt's dresser. There were pictures of Aunt Tina, her grandmother, and of her, but none of her mother or father. In fact, try as she might, Janet couldn't recall what her parents looked like. She felt light as a feather as her room, no, The whole house spun about her. For a second, she could see something else. The bits that formed the universe, that made up everyone and everything. It suddenly became too much, and she passed out. When Janet woke, she was lying in darkness, barely able to make out the faintest details of her room in the dark. She sat up straight upon seeing the woman standing at the foot of her bed. The woman reached out with an open hand. "Are you my mother?" Janet asked. The woman merely smiled, filling Janet with an overwhelming sense of peace. Without hesitation, she reached out. The woman took her hand, and Janet felt oneness. An instant later, morning sun spilled in through the windows. She was alone, the woman nowhere to be seen. The past few days seemed nothing more than a distant, half-forgotten dream. From downstairs came the delicious smell of bacon, scrambled eggs, and hash browns. Hurrying down to the dining room, Janet found the table set for 4. "Well, someone's bright and bushy-tailed this morning." A man stood in the door leading to the kitchen. A pipe in one hand, large Coke bottle glasses hung down on his nose. Janet knew this man. "Dad?" "Who else, honey?" "Where did you come from?" What kind of question is that? Where did I come from? I've always been here. We've always been here." The woman from the hall entered holding a large plate of bacon, followed by her Aunt Tina. Janet smiled. She could feel the world was as it should be. Things had been corrected, and she'd fix them. When she went to school today, she'd fix that. Fix Marcy, too. The world flowed around her. She could feel every speck of it, and how it related to every other speck. In fact, there was another world beyond this one. Perhaps she'd visit that world soon. The monitor beeped, waking Professor Rogers from a dream. He looked at the large computer monitor. Everything appeared in order. All the lights were green. He glanced over at the sleeping girl. A strange device was hooked to her head. Wire ran from it to the computer behind her bed. For all the world, it looked like the tiara a princess would wear. His princess. There was a light rap at the door. It was his assistant, Johnson. "Sorry to disturb you, sir." "Anything wrong? I must admit I dozed off for a little bit." "No, sir, not really. There was a strange echo in there for a while. Then it faded. Your daughter's mind appears to be adapting to the simulation." Rogers rubbed his bloodshot eyes. Good. You should get some sleep. The couch in the break room isn't that bad, really." He nodded. "Actually, that sounds good." He stretched as he took one last look at his comatose daughter. He'd lost his wife in that car accident. He wouldn't lose his daughter, no matter what. "It's a good thing you're doing, sir," Johnson said. "This could help so many others, like your Janet." And after they left, the monitor flickered as a face began to take shape.
Well, that was a bit of a chilling end, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Big thank you to Shane Migliavacca for this week's story. Shane, of course, known for writing the first ever episode of Weekly Spooky, Mischief Night, and so many more great stories. Definitely check out his past work if you haven't already. And remember, we have a brand new horror television series from the people who bring you Weekly Spooky every week called Found Footage, the series. And you can watch it completely free of charge at Tubi TV. And I highly recommend you do, and I would consider it a personal favor. And speaking of personal favors, I could really use a few more backers over at Patreon. That's easy to find at weeklyspooky.com/Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can help the show keep bringing the spooky on the weekly, and you get bonus shows, bonus podcasts, a behind-the-scenes look at everything we do, and more so, my undying and undead gratitude. In fact, speaking of Patreon, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show, and they are Bobbletopia.com, where you can use the code WeeklySpooky at checkout to save 10%, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Christopher Sullivan, Brent McCullough, Gino Lyons, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much for the support, and if you want to hear your name in that list of spooky individuals, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and contribute $15 or more, and you'll get that and so much more. But now, my friends, I need to get out of here. I'm pretty exhausted, to be honest, but I look forward to seeing you all back here very soon. And if you haven't yet, listen to my reading of The Raven from last week. I'm very proud of it. But now, for myself, for my producer Dan Wilder, my executive producer Rob Fields, and my composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you next week, and I can't wait.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.